Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of Vox Vomitus. I am your host, Jennifer Ann Gordon, the author of the Kindle Award-winning novel Beautiful, Frightening, and Silent, as well as the Hotel series and the recently released Pretty Ugly. Joining me today, as always, is my Vox Vomitus vixen, Allison Martine, author of the Bourbon books, which include Dibs in September and Move on Melinda. Today, we are joined by the amazing Tonya Mitchell, the author of A Feigned Madness. Tonya, welcome to Vox Vomitus.
Welcome. Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be here.
We are very excited to have you, not just because your book was amazing, but because your book has several signature cocktails, which we can also talk about later. And your book has signature cocktails, and it's about Victorian era mental institutions. So it's a great combo of two of the things I love.
Great.
Tonya, can you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and a little bit about A Feigned Madness?
Okay. So I'm going to plug the cover. This is A Feigned Madness. It is the story of a woman who came to be known as daredevil reporter Nellie Bly. Her name was Elizabeth Cochran in real life. She started out as a reporter on a small paper in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And she really did some heartfelt stories for women, and the paper hadn't really been representing women. And so she almost immediately had a following and a byline, which for somebody who was only not even 21 at the time was unheard of. So with that following and that growing audience, she thought, well, I'll go to New York and I'll make it even bigger there. So a couple years later, she ends up going to New York, and no one will hire her in New York City because she's a woman. And she's just absolutely flabbergasted. And she's there for maybe 4 or 5 months, and she's running out of money. And then one day, on her way home on an elevated train, she leaves her purse on the train, and it's got the last of her money in it. So she's absolutely desperate. She doesn't want to leave New York and go back to Pittsburgh because she feels like it's going to look like failure. And so she takes one last shot, and she goes into the lobby of what is the largest newspaper on the planet at the time. It's Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, and strikes this crazy deal with an editor there that she will go into an insane asylum by faking insanity for 10 days undercover and then write the story when she gets out. And as if that isn't bizarre enough, he doesn't even really promise her that he'll employ her. All he does is promise, well, if it's good enough, we'll consider maybe having you do a couple more stories. So, but she did it anyway because she was that desperate.
Honestly, that sounds like an R&R from an editor. It's like the same idea. It's like, do all this work and maybe, just maybe, we'll consider it later.
Right.
And then you're like, oh no, I almost went crazy during this process.
Same
right.
thing. Same
my life almost ended. Yeah,
right.
It is the same
Just
thing.
imagine, because it was the two of them really cooking this up. Imagine if he had gotten run over by a train or something like that. And all of a sudden she's in Blackwell's and there's nobody to get her out. I mean, way more worse things that could have happened with this. But luckily, they did eventually pull her out.
I knew the history of this going in, yet as I'm reading your book, and, truth be told, I'm on page 290. I have not finished it yet. I'm still having that panic attack of what if something happens to the editor, even though I know nothing happens, but I'm still just the back of my neck is sweaty, and I'm thinking so many things could go wrong. What if he forgets? What if he just counted the days wrong?
Right.
How does he know? She's going to be like, it's day 10. And he's going to be like, I think she's probably on day 6 now.
Right.
Because he's not paying attention.
And things are getting worse. It's not like, oh, well, now I know what it's like. I'll just have tea and, my 3 meals a day. And, I'll while away the hours like that. It's like, no, the superintendent was really wondering who she really was. She wasn't. There were some curiosities about her, and the longer she was there, I think the more they really thought, is she really who she says she is? So she's butting up against that as well.
Well, and I was going to say, I was enough familiar with the story to know the big plot points, but not all the details that you bring out. And you do such an amazing job that even though I also knew, okay, she has to get out because otherwise the story wouldn't have made it through, at least not in this way. There is so much detail and so much just to the point where you're going, I don't even know if I can keep reading some of these details because they just hurt to read. You just do a phenomenal job. So anybody who's
Thank you.
I'm a little squeamish, this is a book maybe to take in chunks and installments and then get back into it because it just drives on. But the other part, you weave such another story with it that it's not just told from those 10 days in the asylum. So I'm really just as much curious about all of that and where that storyline came from. Do you want to speak a little bit to that and her time with the flowers?
I know.
Yeah.
I was going to say, can we talk about the flowers?
The flowers,
Talk
please.
about the flowers. So Nellie, when she does get out, eventually writes 2 installments for the New York World that happen consecutive Sundays. And back then, newspapers were like 8 columns across, and the text was like 6 point or something. It was tiny, but they were really long stories, and they were accompanied with black and white illustrations. I forgot what the question was.
The flowers. We were
flowers.
Like, okay, so she's in the institution, but then you also weave this other narrative with her and a
Okay.
And
so
the flowers.
From the time that she got out and wrote the story, she knew that it was going to be a newspaper audience. And so when you read it, you know what's happening inside and how bad it is and what she's facing. But you don't know anything personal about her. Why was she so desperate to get there? Was she married? What kind of a family did she have? So I brought all those questions to her 10 Days in a Madhouse that is now in book form. You can actually order her installment, and thought, how can I embellish this? Because there's so much more to her than what she puts in her story. And so I read her biographies. I looked up her family. I found old letters that she had handwritten that were at the Carnegie Library in Pittsburgh. I went to see her home in Apollo, Pennsylvania. And I really started to put the meat on the bones. But probably the biggest surprise was that there's a paragraph in 10 Days in a Madhouse where she talks about this man that comes to see her. And this is where things kind of took off for me. And I kind of got that spidey sense, like there's something going on here and I need to really dig more. So she went the way of the police courts to get to the asylum. So she was actually arrested and she stood before a judge. But the judge felt really sorry for her and said, you know what? I really hate to send you to Blackwell's, but let's have these illustrators that were at court, illustrate your likeness, put them in the newspaper, and then maybe you'll be found that way. Because her whole story was, I have amnesia. I don't know who I am. And, she was acting crazy at the same time. And so she's absolutely frantic that somebody is going to recognize her because of all these illustrations that are turning up in the papers. So when she gets there, she's got a couple visitors that are coming in looking for their long lost sweetheart, their long lost wife or whatever. And of course, she's not that person. But then there's one person that comes, and this is taken right from her own words. This is what she says. I went to the sitting room at the end of the hall, and there sat a gentleman who had known me intimately for years. I saw by the sudden blanching of his face and his inability to speak that the sight of me was wholly unexpected and had shocked him terribly. In an instant, I determined, if he betrayed me as Nellie Bly, to say I had never seen him before. However, I had one card to play, and I risked it. With Miss Grady within touching distance, one of the nurses, I whispered hurriedly to him in language more expressive than elegant, "Don't give me away." I knew by the expression in his eye that he understood, so I said to Miss Grady, "I do not know this man." "Do you know her?" asked Miss Grady. "No, this is not the young lady I came in search of," he replied in a strained voice. The sudden blanching of his face, he had known me intimately. I'm like, who is this guy? Why would she put a whole paragraph about someone like this and not tell us who he was? Why would she
intimately?
Intimately.
It's like she was like reaching over me, over my shoulder and saying, "Oh my God, you have to tell this story." I couldn't believe it. So then I started investigating who this guy might be. She hadn't been in New York for very long, so no one could have known her intimately. It had to have been somebody back in Pittsburgh. And if I looked into Pittsburgh, the paper itself, who would I find? Well, it so happened that there was another New York correspondent there that had been on the same paper as her, that was in New York City the same time that she was, and that was George McCain. So I was like 98.5% certain that it was him.
I like that
wondered-
you chose him because I find him to be so dreamy and amazing. And in my brain, he's Adam Driver.
Everybody's Adam Driver to you.
Well, he's very tall and he's dark and
picture him-
brooding.
He's tall, dark, and handsome. Yeah.
I didn't picture him as Adam Driver at all.
Well,
so
if
that's
there's
just one
somebody
thing.
pretending to be insane and then there's a love interest, I am the insane one. And it's always going to be Adam Driver.
That's fair. That's fair.
There we go.
I couldn't find out much about him. There was so much about her. There was just a little bit about him. And so I went to ancestry.com because I really wanted to know more about him. And I found a picture of him, and he was very, very handsome.
Okay, who does
And
he look
was
like?
about her same age.
Okay.
And then I found something else about him that you guys know from reading as far as you have that the other readers don't know, prospective readers don't know. And I don't want to say what that something is, but it made it very obvious to me why she didn't mention who he was, nor he never said, even after she got out and he wrote articles about her and how proud of her he was and how much he was so happy she was getting all this fan mail and all these speaking engagements. He was so happy. He never said once that he had ever gone to see her in the asylum. And I thought, okay, I know why. How can I make these two communicate in a way that would be the way they would have communicated in the 1880s? And so then I thought about, I have to do the language of flowers. And so I used these cards of a way that the two communicate with one another throughout the book.
I love it so much. I mean, I just have to say, as just as a storytelling device, it is lovely. And it is
thank you so much.
like it's so Victorian era. And I love the Victorian era. I too wrote a book about a hospital or a hotel that's, where ladies go to rest.
And drink laudanum tea.
It's certainly, I mean, it wasn't as vicious as Blackwell, but doing my research of this whole time period, I just became very, not obsessed, but I love all of the customs, the supposed politeness that's happening and what's happening underneath.
Right. The terms and phrase, I found that they have such a beautiful flowery language that goes so well with all those layers of clothes that they're wearing. Yeah. But yet women are still so constrained. The technological marvel of the Industrial Revolution is taking off, and there's more and more modern things coming. But it just seems like women are still sort of trapped in their corsets, not able to being out alone without the presence of a man. And, there was dating etiquette. It wasn't really dating, your parents are present or
it's people leaving their calling cards at your house. And then you're just sitting in a stuffy room while you're sweaty because you're wearing 1,000 layers.
Right.
And your great Aunt Margaret is just sitting there watching you not flirt with a man.
That's exactly how it was.
Or in Elizabeth's case, a guy who she's not even remotely interested in just keeps showing up. And it's like, will he please not be here anymore? And there's nothing she can really do. She has to go to Mexico to get away from this guy.
Yeah, she has no agency at all. She's just please leave me alone. And her whole family's like, you should definitely marry him.
Right. Because he's acceptable. That's all. He's alive. Right. He seems to be all right. And
we've given him the thumbs up. It doesn't matter that you find him deplorable and he's 30 years older than you. You're going to do it.
Right. But you're 21 now. And look, your prospects are not getting better.
Right. Mm-hmm. You don't want to be 22 and not be married.
Well, and one of the big things so much of Nellie's story is driven by poverty and her own family poverty and how everything got to the point of here she is supporting not just herself but her mother, and she's not able to make choices based on what's really best for me, but what's going to get me to pay back rent and what can I do, because she is dependent on men in so many ways, including giving her jobs and men squandering family wealth and things like that.
Right.
And even in the story, and I hope this isn't considered a spoiler, but part of the reason she's in this is that her father had multiple families, and when he passed away, didn't provide for her family.
Right.
So all of that puts her in this position where, she does have to go out there and take ridiculous risks. Right. Because otherwise she's never going to have a chance unless she can go do something different. But that's not where her heart is either. So some of these risks are on her, but some of them are also on this situation.
And she had so many issues like that were men letting her down, even though even though her father, didn't die intentionally, he became ill and died suddenly. He never provided a will for his second family. And so the 10 children that he had with his first wife, who had died, because he was quite a wealthy man. They lived in a very large, like 10,000 square foot home. They had, horses and carriages. She had a pony. She dressed in these pink dresses. I mean, they were a well-known family. But when he died, most of their fortune went to the other 10 children, who were already themselves adults, because Nellie's mother was a good 30 years younger than her father. So he dies when she's about 6, and they go from living large relatively to renting a small home and having to get rid of everything because they just can't afford it anymore. And then even more disastrously, her mother remarries a few years later and could not have chosen a worse man. And to her credit, I don't think anybody knew what he was until after they were married. But, he was a drinker, he was abusive. And Nellie was spunky even then, and actually testified in her mother's behalf in court, and would say all of the vulgar words that he used to call her mother, and she's, 12 years old at the time. So that was another man that had let her down. So I think that's when we see the emergence of the spunk in her, and her realizing that if she doesn't take agency herself, she's going to end up nowhere because she can't really depend on men.
Yeah. Like her sister is saying like, oh, you've never been in love. You've never done this. Oh, you don't know anything. But like Nellie, it's coming from like this point of actually being this very emotionally sound observer of kind of this lifetime of strange tragedies.
Yes. Very strange tragedy.
Because it's like, it's just like the way things lined up. It's like, how did this happen to one person who, when they were 6 years old, they had a pony and lived in a mansion?
Right.
Well, and I think that gave her such a great perspective too, because I think that, and especially when she gets to the asylum, she runs into people who maybe never expected anything different out of life because they always kind of were the downtrodden.
Right.
Whereas Nellie had seen both sides, or Elizabeth had seen both sides. There's a lovely story or whole idea about how she ends up with the pseudonym, and why she ends up with the pseudonym, and why the women were being told to take pseudonyms, but not the men. And I just thought it was interesting because I write under a pseudonym, but it's not because I'm a woman. It's because I write in 2 genres.
Right.
And I thought that was so interesting that they're like, oh, we can't reveal her identity, and why that would make a difference. But the men weren't expected to do that.
Right.
Was that a common practice back then? Do you know, or was that
a common practice?
That particular, okay, so not just that particular.
It was a common practice. It was. First of all, it was considered quite vulgar for women to write for papers anyway. So if you were going to go down that vulgar path of being so spunky to think that you could even compete with men in that way, you better not do it with your real name. You need to hide.
Calm your spunkiness down.
What's that?
I said, calm your spunkiness down.
That's right.
Channel your spunk into a different name.
Yeah.
One of the older women who works on the paper in Pittsburgh that she meets, that sort of takes her under her wing, but it doesn't last very long, was Bessie Bramble.
I hate her.
What?
I said, I hate her.
Yeah.
I love her name, by the way.
I love her name.
Bessie Bramble.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. It's like, I hate to say this. That would be a great burlesque name.
Okay, this is how we're different. I think it sounds like a Hobbit name. Like,
oh, I thought a
Bramble?
superhero's girlfriend and or a burlesque performer.
Okay, that's Betty Ross, and then move on.
I think Bessie Bramble sounds like an old Southern dessert to me. Would you like some Bessie Bramble?
Yeah.
Would you like your Bessie Bramble with a side of ice cream?
Yeah, no, that's peach crumble. So, but there's bramble crumble.
Bramble crumble.
I'll eat it.
Fair enough.
Now
is there
I'm
a
hungry.
Bessie Bramble cocktail? Is it spiked with just arsenic in there?
The Bessie Bramble cocktail is literally just rubbing alcohol with like a black olive in it.
Yeah. Oh, that's terrible.
But there's a situation with this older woman who you want her to take Nellie under her wing, but when it becomes inconvenient for her to do it, she sort of throws her to the wolves. And that wasn't something I wanted to sugarcoat. That was something I wanted to let people know that, hey, even when women did get to a point where they were elevated to a level where they could report, it wasn't like all the sisters got together and were hugely supportive. It wasn't necessarily like that.
Okay, well, it must have been so competitive, though, because it's like one newspaper and they hire a woman, and that's shocking. And then they hire a younger woman.
No. Right.
And that's even more shocking. So I could understand Bessie Bramble's fear, but it's not forgivable.
It's not. And I was going to say, you do really cover this whole idea of not just, she does have some female friends who are other reporters. So it isn't just like these two lone wolves fighting each other.
Yeah.
But
once
also,
she gets to New York. Yeah.
Exactly. I want to say one of them was Fanny. Is it Fanny and Violet? Am I making those up?
And
right?
Viola. It's Fanny.
Viola. Okay.
And they're real people. And they were on the New York World. They were stuck within the confines of what Viola likes to call petticoat journalism.
I loved that.
I loved that.
I wrote that down.
Fashion. Well, I kind of made it up, but they were stuck in, fashion and town gossip and, theater.
Skincare. Ladies at lunch.
Mm-hmm. Right. Ladies at lunch. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And they didn't like it either. But I sort of made them, I kind of went out on a limb and thought, if Nellie's doing this and she's friends with them, she would definitely want to help them. And so there's that scene where they're all together and she's saying, you need to go to Cockrell and say, this is the kind of stuff that you want to do. Because if I'm doing it, you guys can do it too.
Well, and I really also wanted to point out, because we talked a little bit about how the men had let her down. When we get to the asylum, the men aren't helping, but the big bads are primarily the women. And I don't mean the other inmates. I mean the nurses. And
the nurses are terrifying.
I had no idea. I mean, when you have these ideas of these older style mental institutions where they're just abusing patients, I had no idea it was like woman on woman, just violence and cruelty for cruelty's sake.
Right.
And I'm assuming most of that's in Nellie's book. I don't know how much of those things then you researched more or maybe made up. Like
a lot of it is in her own write-up. Grady was almost immediately a villain. And I don't think there was one nurse who was kind that when she gets to the other hall.
Yeah, when they move.
Most of them, and I think more than anything else, this is me just guessing. I think that those positions drew women who weren't very well educated to begin with. They didn't really have a lot of, quote, what we would consider nursing knowledge at this time. And so it was a way for them who had been down on their luck, didn't have a lot of money, to come in and be able to have power over somebody else.
And maybe these weren't like the marrying kind of women. Like they're we can take that in multiple ways. Either they're homely, they are, their sexual proclivities have made them be kind of victims in their own right, like as children, and maybe they just anger out. I don't know. I try to figure out these nurses because you depict them so brilliantly and brutally that I'm like, it's like a pack of hyenas to me.
Yeah,
but as a fellow writer, I think all writers were just like, why are they
awful?
Like
right?
this?
Yeah.
What happened? What happened when you were a kid that made you think that the things that happen in the lavatory are okay to happen?
Right.
Well, and so much of that too, it seemed like if it was one bad apple, but it's like, no, this is a magnet for the apples to all go and rot, or one makes the other one worse and brings that out. And then it just becomes this system that feeds on itself. And again, those are the parts where I'm so glad you had both stories in there, because for those who haven't read it yet, it kind of jumps between two years apart timeline wise, before she goes in and while she's in.
Yeah.
Because if I would have had to read that straight, I would have had to be
I've had a lot of people say the same thing. And honestly, people have said, well, it might have been a little better if you weren't so brutal. Maybe if you could cut out this part or that.
No.
And
you need that truth.
I don't want to sugarcoat what it was like back then.
You're not writing that historical fiction that's pretty fiction. You're not it's the Victorian era, but everything's everyone's lovely and clean, and it was
not
awesome
that kind of
women.
story, and it wasn't that kind of story for her. So I felt like I had to do her justice and talk about how really ugly and awful it was.
Well,
now, sorry.
I was gonna say, I felt like you absolutely did, but I just wanted to praise the fact that you were using those two different timelines, so it didn't become for a reader. So if for anyone who's watching this now and goes, I'm kind of interested in the story, but could I handle reading the book? You can, because you have like that respite every other chapter to go back to the language of flowers and these other people and her struggling to come up in the world versus she's literally having the clothing stripped off of her and these things happening to her.
So I had a question. So we were talking before the show that you have a journalism background. Mm-hmm. So how much of your like spunky journalist persona of who you are went into like your research of this and your passion for who Nellie was?
I have always been one of those people that will go down deep, dark rabbit holes because I loved, and the darker and scarier it is, the more I want to go down.
There's no judgment here.
I'm just going to drink to that. You keep going.
I'm like, as a horror writer,
I'm going to have a drink of my Nellie Bly. I mean, honestly, it was so interesting to me. I mean, mental illness has a long way to go even now. I think we're still putting people in a box and saying you're different than us.
Yeah.
But it is a lot better than it was. And there's medication now that, that there wasn't then. But I went down a dark hole, excuse me, and got as much information as I could. I mean, I read everything from books on Blackwell's Island. Like everything going on in that island was bad. It wasn't just, we're going to put these nice homes and, these couple of businesses, and then we're going to put an insane asylum there. Oh, no. We're going to put a penitentiary for men. We're going to put workhouses for the poor. We're going to put an insane asylum, a hospital for the, people who can't afford it. I mean, it was like no man's land. It was terrible. And people often didn't come back. It was a one-way trip. But I think to answer your question, I used everything that I had learned in journalism school to dig up as much as I could. I mean, I found a map from 1888 on Etsy that I blew up poster size of Manhattan, so I could figure out where the ferry would have left from Manhattan to get over the East River to Blackwell's Island. It has Blackwell's Island on it, and it shows where the asylum was. It shows where all the elevated trains are because I wanted to be specific. Like, I don't want her going to some station that wouldn't make any sense. Like I had to know, would she have walked to the newspaper from where she was, or would she have taken a train? No, she would have taken a train, and it would have taken about this long of time. I mean, that's just kind of what you have to do to get into that area. And I loved it.
Well, and the detail you do it's phenomenal. So you just kind of become part of that era. And it just becomes really flowing. So I never got pulled out of any of that.
Oh, good.
You did a wonderful job. But I also don't know nearly enough so that if you had some kind of, other than someone's checking a digital watch, I would have been like, that seems anachronistic. Other than that, I probably would have let you slide on it. But just the way you present it is just so masterfully done. I did have a question about the flowers. This is gonna
yeah.
So not a spoiler because, again, this is part of something that happens in her life. She goes to Mexico at one point.
She does.
And in one of her stories about Mexico, she references flowers. Did that happen? Is that a story you found, or did you do a little bit of creative license on that one?
Goosebumps, because when I was trying to figure out how those guys could communicate, I looked at all of the stories that Nellie was doing at that time, right before Mexico and right when she was in Mexico. And every one of them was either about trees, like Arbor Day. There's a scene where she's doing a story about like the floral arrangements for weddings for the spring. I lifted that almost verbatim right off something that she had already written, that Mr. Brady that ran the shop. He was talking about the language of flowers. He talked about the language of flowers. He mentioned it. And so she put that in her story, that line in there about it, which makes McCain actually put the book in her mailbox. That part, was me being creative, but everything was about flowers. Then she gets to La Viga, the gardens at La Viga, and it's all about flowers. So I looked up, I looked at exactly the flowers that she had mentioned in her article. And then I looked up their meanings in the language of flowers. And I'm like, oh my God, this can be the language that she uses sort of her own love letter that she's giving him, but she's giving it to him through the news, like through the newspaper.
I love it.
And if you look at the beginning of the book, because I was picky because I wanted to lift it verbatim. And so I had the publisher list the things that came directly from her own lines, because I didn't, I wanted to give her the credit, where the credit was due. So a lot of things were lifted directly like that. I'm glad that you mentioned that.
And you're a journalist, you know to quote people.
What's that?
So you're a journalist, you know to quote people. Like you're like, oh, I have to make sure this is actually correct.
Right.
And you said what exactly? Okay, perfect.
Yes, verbatim. Got to get it right.
So I'm sometimes Jennifer's eyes because I wear the glasses and she doesn't. So we have a question here from I'm going to butcher your name. I'm sorry if I butcher your name, either Leisha or Leisha Haney. Tonya, do your book characters talk to you? And if they do, have you had to change something in the story about it?
Nellie talked to me a lot. I felt like, this is going to sound really corny, but I felt like when I was writing, she was looking over my shoulder to make sure that I was getting it just right.
She's a reporter. She would.
Yeah.
She'd
be like, you're quoting me.
Picky. She'd want me to get it right.
And I think
after all these years exposing McCain, I think she's probably okay with that. She's been gone a while.
They're over it.
But I don't know that I've ever changed anything that they've said that I needed to change. I can't say that. It's more that they've helped me along the way to kind of cultivate the story as you go along.
Well, and maybe some of that is just because you've had, okay, it's Leisha. Okay, that's wonderful. I'm glad I didn't butcher it too badly. I was just going to say, I wonder how much of it is because you've done such a good job as the journalist yourself, getting their story right. There isn't much to change because you actually nailed it, rather than if they're going, no, that's not even close, Tonya. What are you doing? they would have come with their red pencils and gone, fix.
That's
Your
right.
penmanship is terrible. As a writer, I'm really glad that we no longer care about how a person's handwriting is, because mine's not legible at all.
Mine looks like
she
serial
actually
killer.
had really good handwriting. I was able to look at a lot of her letters at the Carnegie Library, and she wrote really, really beautifully.
So then why is she getting all this flack about, your penmanship?
Because she wrote with pencil, and she would erase things and then like write over it, things like that.
Do it.
And I think, I don't think her grammar was really all that good when she first started out on the Dispatch, because I remember Erasmus, who she calls QO, kind of saying, you might want to brush up on a little bit of grammar, because she hadn't trained to be a journalist.
Right.
She actually gets the job.
She didn't have very much schooling
and writes a letter to the editor.
Exactly. And that the whole idea of her not even getting to finish her just general schooling, because back to the men who done her wrong,
right?
She didn't have the funds to continue schooling. So here she has this drive to do something that she needs more education really to do, but she doesn't even let that stop her. She'll just push forward to do it. But yeah, we were saying this wasn't a job she necessarily sought. She just wrote a letter to the editor.
Yeah.
And
of all things, it was the columnist trying to pigeonhole women into that position of basically being barefoot and pregnant and not doing anything else. And I could just see I could see steam coming out of her ears and her face just like, are you kidding me? Because her reply is what got her a position on the paper.
Well, and I love the relationship those two form afterwards, because instead of taking it as like, how dare you, young woman, know your place, it was like, okay, maybe I really don't know. Could you show me what young women are like and educate me? And don't you wish most people had that kind of attitude? Can't we all have a little QO?
I feel like we all need that right now.
Yeah.
It's like things haven't changed that much.
No, they really haven't.
Like we do. We all need a little QO in our life.
Yeah.
So
he was one of my favorite characters to write, because he was good. I think he was the father to her that she never had. Yes. At least that's how I consider him.
No, that's how it
for
read.
them to start out like this and then become, almost soulmates for each other, and that mentor-mentee. I really like that. But the letters, by the way, that I saw that she hand wrote were to him. They were to him.
Oh my gosh, I would love to see those. How long was your research process for this? And when you were researching, were you actively writing, or did you research, and then let the draft come as it might?
I feel like the research took forever. I did the deep dive for a long time, and I was really scared that somebody else was going to come out with a novel before I did, because I'm like, how long can it be before somebody else gets this, gets this idea?
To be fair, though, they had 100 years and nobody wrote one. So
right. And since then, 2 other books have come out. Just so you know, like,
well, that's like the
I didn't know that.
universe, like the energy in the universe. I just feel like if the idea is that good, like I'm always like, stop thinking about your idea, because even though you're not talking about it, it's going to somehow
It'll get out there,
leak out.
And they're a little bit different. One of them doesn't concentrate so much on the asylum so much. It's a little bit different. But yeah,
So was it years of research?
It was years. Part of it is, I'm just going to say it, like, you can read all of the craft books that you want, but when you're writing your first book, it's basically you and a blank sheet of paper, or you and a blank screen. And you've got to figure it out. You have to teach yourself how to write a book while you're writing a book.
Yes.
And it's trial and error. It's, one day you're like, oh my God, this is the best book ever. And then the next day you are down in the drums drinking vodka because you can't, you don't feel like you have any talent at all. So
this is
why a lot of that. I have a lot of imposter syndrome.
I feel like this is why our show is called Vox Vomitus, which is like fake Latin for word vomit, because Allison and I had a very similar kind of like path in some ways, where like our first book released at the same time, and we write and we like check in with each other, and it'll always be like, how's it going? And it's like, I'm going to win an award. Like, I am going to become incredibly famous. And then like an hour later,
where's the Pulitzer for us to drink? I need that one now.
Where it's like, I can't even, these aren't even sentences. I don't know how to write. What are words? There's nothing happening.
What did I think I could do? Like, what have I done?
Yeah. Why did I think I was a novelist?
Why did I? And it changes on a dime. It's not like you're a whole week of feeling like you're horrible. It lasts a couple days, maybe a couple minutes, and then you're on to the next stage of it.
And honestly, the best visual I've seen, or actually bit of film I've seen, is it's when Rapunzel in the movie Tangled has gotten down from her towel and she's vacillating. This is the best day ever. I am a horrible daughter. Like back and forth and back and forth. It's pretty much the same way as far as how you feel about it. And especially, like you mentioned, it was your first novel. I mean, this was an amazing first novel. I mean, I didn't know that when I started reading it. I only figured that out when I was trying to do a graphic for the show, and it was saying it was your debut, because I assumed, based on the quality of this one, that there had been others and I just hadn't heard of them yet because my head was under a rock. But that whole idea of, until you have outside verification, some of that is really hard to do, and that imposter syndrome. And what was the publishing process for you like then, as far as getting that outside verification and going through,
I know, take that drink.
But yeah, I was gonna say, I know this, but I don't know who published you or what the situation was, whether you did this with a smaller press or a larger press or any of that. So fill us all in.
I decided from the beginning that I didn't want to self-publish, that I wanted to go with a traditional publisher. And the main reason was, I didn't know anything about self-publishing. And secondly was, I wanted my book to be in a bookstore, because that was my dream, to walk in and see my book spine on a bookshelf in a bookstore. And so I finished the novel. I had many beta readers look it over. I don't know how many drafts I did, like probably hundreds. I got to the point where you get sick of it because you're working on it so long. It's like the stepchild after a while. And then I went to look for an agent, and I found an agent who absolutely loved Nellie Bly and had loved Nellie Bly since she was like 12. And she's like, oh my God, there's never been a book out about this. Like, this is great. This is wonderful. And so it took forever. For like the next, I would say like a year and a half, she went to the top publishers, the ones in New York, and sent them the manuscript. But she, you have to wait. Like they have a huge reading list. You're number 30 or 100 or whatever on the list. And so it took a year and a half to get through there. And I didn't get an offer. And I had to back off from the editor or the agent, because I didn't know where else to go. I didn't know what else to do. And she said, you know what? That's probably a good idea. Keep working on it. Maybe send it to a developmental editor and see what she says. And so,
So wait, they wanted you to go to a developmental editor after you'd already landed with the agent. So the agent did the agent have you do
because
any edits first?
we didn't get enough information from the publishers
Mm-hmm.
who said no for them to say, oh, well, okay, it must be this. I'll go work on it.
You didn't get any marching orders saying, okay, no, thank you, but change this. So you didn't get like a request for, like, I made a joke much earlier about the R&R, which is a request to revise and resubmit. So sometimes that happens, and then people
didn't have anything like that. Okay. I wish that had been the case, but it wasn't. And so she and I parted company amicably, and I found an editor who specializes in historical fiction. I was to the point where I wasn't even sure that I could write well. I thought I found an editor or an agent who loves Nellie Bly. Maybe the story sucks, and it's because of Nellie Bly.
No, I understand exactly what you're saying. You're like, you loved the concept, but was I actually writing something you liked, or you just wanted to like it because you liked the concept so much?
I understand
that completely.
So, and I spoke to her on the phone. I sent her the manuscript, and she said, "Oh my God, you can totally write. Like, it's not about that." But she said, I want more of George McCain. You have to put more of George McCain in there. Like, this whole language of flowers thing, you got to do more of that. You got to do.
So the first draft didn't have that much of that?
What's that?
So the first draft didn't have as much of that?
Not as much, because I was afraid that people were going to come to the book thinking like sort of dark, Gothic, insane asylum. And then they were going to be disappointed if it became like too romancy. I wasn't sure that I could do both of those justice and have.
You did, yeah.
But you absolutely did.
You did.
And I say that as someone who, by trade, I read a lot of romance because I write romance. So I have to read romance because they make me. And most romances don't do nearly as good a job conveying those feels that you need. And you did it through the language of flowers.
And I love that, because I came to it with like, I want to read a book about a mental institution. And then I was like, oh no, a love story. But then I was like very roped into that, and I loved it. And I was, again, thankful that it happened. Good. Because
I'm really glad.
Yeah.
So thank you.
I'm glad that I pulled that off, because I feel like after I added a few more of those scenes, I felt like it just sort of felt more like everything gelled to me. Like I was telling her story the way she had told it, but I had added enough personal elements about her to give the reader more. Because the other thing I was butting up against was Nellie's already told this story. She told it over 100 years ago, but she's already written it. Like, what am I adding to it? And I felt like with more the embellishment of him that I was able, to bring that to the book.
Yeah, it was great.
So after
the developmental
after that, I made the changes, and then I started going around to the smaller publishers, which took just as long. And I
still have to read it.
And I ended up with a small publisher. I have like the two of you are writing buddies. I have a local girlfriend of mine, Melissa, and she had just found a publisher for her historical fiction. And the process that she was going through with them, they were so collaborative. Like, she had say on her cover, she had say on her back cover. They asked all kinds of questions. They didn't want to hurt her feelings. And I'm like, oh my God, they sound awesome. She goes, well, submit your manuscript. And luckily they loved it too. So now we're accountability partners. We're still writing together now, although COVID's kind of made it weird. But we're with the same publisher, and I've had the same experience. I absolutely love them. They're actually more of a boutique publisher. They don't do like 10 or 12 books a year. They do more like, 2 or 3. But they specialize mostly in historical fiction. And I just can't say enough positive things about them. They just
tell us the name of that.
Okay, so it starts with the C, but it's a hard C. It's Kynren. K-Y-N-R-E-N. Kynren.
Is that Welsh?
Yes.
It sounds Welsh.
It means kindred in Old English, maybe? Or maybe
that would explain why when you get a C-Y-N, I'm like, that's got to be Welsh, because it makes almost, whenever we were looking for names, like my two of my children have Irish and Welshish names. Whenever you start seeing things that just don't make sense phonetically, it's usually Welsh.
So it's probably Welsh. And then their imprint is Kennan Books, which is Cennan, Kennan Books.
Kennan Books.
So I just have been so happy with them. They've just been phenomenal.
I will say I did look them up after we booked you, and I was just looking at their website, and I was just thought they looked amazing.
Oh, good.
And like really great, like quality of work. The covers, lovely.
Yeah, they do
So-
some coffee table books too. They do a really beautiful coffee table books.
Well, you showed us the cover of your book earlier, and I stole it for a graphic because we were given advanced reader copies to see, so I don't have a copy to show and go, look how beautiful this is. So I'm glad that you held yours up because it is a gorgeous cover, and I think it really conveys just the whole sense of it with what she's wearing and then like the gates of the asylum. It has this kind of eerie feeling.
Yeah,
but
they
still
actually
that era too.
asked me to send them. They said if we need to know like the mood that you're going for. Like we have our own ideas, but we don't want to work a long time on it and have you go, no, I don't really like that. So tell me what you like. So I actually sent them other book covers that I really liked and told them what elements I liked. And I said, I want people to know, obviously, that it's historical fiction from the beginning, but I also want entrapment. Like I need people to know that this is a woman who is trapped, which is one of those Gothic tropes about the woman in the lonely home, in this case, the asylum or whatever. And
she probably wished she was a little bit more lonely.
Yeah.
Leave me alone, please.
Right.
Tonya, you've been amazing. And this book, again, I'm not done. I'm probably going to finish it tonight because I'm going to stay up all night. Was everything I really wanted right now. I haven't read historical fiction in a while. I feel like it's been months. We haven't. I know. I look at you, Allison. I'm like, what have I read in the past month?
So the only thing we read that was historical fiction was the one where the author said, no, this was my life story. You're calling me old by calling this historical.
Oh, yeah. And that wasn't historical fiction.
It was set in the
still
60s.
Living historical
fiction.
Yes,
well, exactly. Yeah. And she's like, wait a second. The 1960s are not historical fiction. How dare you? But that's what it was listed as when you look at some of the categories on Amazon. And I'm like, don't yell at me. I'm just telling you where you're ranked.
Yeah.
So this it's been a while since I've read historical fiction, and I didn't know how much I wanted to read a novel about Nellie Bly until you wrote it. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I've really appreciated the time with you guys. It's been really fun.
It's been great. So Allison, thank you, of course, for everything. Thank you, everybody who is watching this live and who is going to be and who will be watching it on the replay. Thank you to Roman, our producer, Pam Stack, our executive producer, and everybody at the Global Authors on the Air radio network. This has been a copywritten podcast from the Global Authors on the Air. And stay tuned next week when we have Gervase Haggerty joining us discussing her new debut novel. So we will talk to you